Good day to you. I am Crystal J. Paul and want to welcome you to this special interview as we hear about the life of David Augustus Straker, the late David Augustus Straker, his roots to Barbados, his work there in the US, and of course, his impact on the civil rights movement years after his death. And I'm so honored, so pleased to have with us today uh, Wayne County Probate Judge Terrence Keith there in Michigan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, Crystal. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. And of course, Reverend Dr. Patrick Tanis, we all know as Patrick.
Hi, Crystal J. Hi, Judge Keith.
How are you, Patrick? Good to see you again.
Good to see you, my dear friend. And I see that you're looking warm and cozy, even though we know outside it's freezing.
As long as I stay inside, I'm good.
Yes, so we're sending some sunshine to you over there and some warmth in Michigan.
You need every ray.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, you know what? David Augustus Straker, he would have played quite an integral role in history in the United States. And just to understand, to learn that he was a Barbadian is of great significance. And we know that, Patrick, you have a wealth of knowledge as it relates to his roots here in Barbados. Could you let us know who was David Augustus Straker and his significance in history to us here?
Well, thank you, Crystal J. And thank you for having us, me and my dear friend, Judge Keith. And, David Augustus Straker turned up in my research as I was preparing a speech for the Bar Association with Dr. Sir Trevor Carmichael, who invited me to come and share with him, to hold the stage down, as we would say, to share. And I did my research and found this interesting gentleman, David Augustus Straker, born in Barbados in the 1800s. And he, at 17 years old, he became the headmaster of the first free colored, quote unquote, colored school for people of color, and it was the first in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
He was out tutored by the principal of Covington College, which we know to be in Barbados, the first Bible school in the entire Western Hemisphere. And then, in addition to that, I was able to journey all the way up to Detroit, Michigan, where I was able to share on David Augustus Straker with a dear friend, Judge Keith, who is one of the most outstanding and brilliant minds, as we know, in the legal fraternity. And Judge Keith was able to host me up there, and I was able to share about David Augustus Straker, and to find out that the solid, and I mean very high-ranking legal minds had put together, and under the leadership of Judge Keith, to form the David Augustus Straker Bar Association, to reflect the renown of this great Barbadian and his work in the United States. I was amazed, and I saw some of the top minds in the entire United States legal system come together, and Judge Keith was principally the leader of that group, and I was able to see how they honored this Barbadian. And I really am going to step back and let him share a lot more about this unique person in history and what he accomplished, because it's huge. And I'm going to leave that to let Judge Keith tell us about it. Over
All
to you, my
right. Yeah.
friend.
Okay. Where do you want me to start?
Well, if you could let us know, if you would, what would have led to David Augustus Straker's work there in Michigan? We know that he first began in South Carolina, where he would have educated former slaves. But how did his work begin there?
Well, actually, actually, long before South Carolina, uh, he left Barbados to go to Kentucky. He was um, the bishop of the AME Church had been in Barbados looking for folks to educate the recently freed slaves in the United States. And he asked the headmaster at Cordian College, did he know of anyone? And that's when Straker was approached, and he volunteered to be part of that. And that was 1866, I believe. Um, and so he left Barbados to go to um, Kentucky, where he was teaching there. But one of the things that you discover about Straker is that he had a very active intellectual spirit that never allowed him to stay too long at one place when another opportunity to educate himself was made available to him. Because not long after being in Kentucky, he decided that he would go to Howard University to get a degree in law. He obtained his degree in 1871 from Howard, what was called an LLB at the time. And as it happens, it was in that time at Howard that he met his future wife, Annie. And they married in 1871. So I'm assuming at the end of their classes. And Annie was from Detroit. Her family was originally from Detroit. And it appears that like so many couples do now who meet in college, they may go home and meet her parents, and in this case, they retreated to Detroit and married and came back to DC. That's a significant point with regards to the future of Straker and Straker's relationship with Detroit and the state of Michigan, because at the time, Annie was named Annie Carey, came from a very prestigious Black family, whose last name was Richards. They had moved to Detroit in 1854, I believe. And her aunt, Fanny Richards, had become noted as the first Black teacher in the city of Detroit and to be hired in the school system, public school system. And that enabled her to get connected. But at any rate, they leave Detroit after they got married, come back to Washington, D.C., and he takes up a position with the Treasury's office, United States Treasury's office for a little while, for about 4 years. And then he takes on a position in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, to become a member of a custom inspector. And he was there for held that position for about 4 years while trying to develop a law practice. Now, I got to take a step back here because there's another interesting part about South Carolina, his being in South Carolina, as it relates to Barbados and how it affected Straker. Because as I'm sure you all know, the history of slavery and the relationship of slavery of Barbados in South Carolina, that back in the late 1600s, that when land got so sparse and so expensive, folks started looking, we have to find some other place to take advantage of this sugar crop that the Dutch help was put together. And so they sailed at different places. One place, was Jamaica. Other place was the Carolinas. And some decades later, they brought the brutal slave codes that were the most harsh in the West Indies that were in Barbados to South Carolina. And those racial tones set the history for South Carolina to this day. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. Because he takes up a position in South Carolina while the radical Republicans and the Republicans were at full measure on a national level in United States politics. This is shortly after Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Andrew Johnson had become president, but the radical Republicans were pushing through all this legislation that gave former slaves tremendous liberties, guarantees under the Constitution. As a matter of fact, There is a professor out of Carolina that does a show that's called the As Seen on Radio. And they do a marvelous piece about saying how this period of Reconstruction is actually the second revolution, because it's really the first time that everybody is being guaranteed and given equal rights under the Constitution. And it was a matter that because of the changes that were taking place, Blacks had significant roles in deciding their own fate. Thus, after the 13th Amendment, you had the 14th, 15th Amendment to come along to ensure the rights to vote. But again, I'm leading up to South Carolina.
Well, it's a rich history, so yes, please.
So you have the federal government, as part of this Reconstruction Plan, setting the tone that in the Confederate States, that we are now going to have a federal presence guaranteeing that the slaves' rights are protected, former slaves' rights are protected. And they put in federal troops in all of the 11 of the Confederate States. Those states were required to have new constitutions drawn up, and has new conventions for state constitutions that required that the former slaves actively participate. In South Carolina, where you had a state that was predominantly Black now, because the slaves are now voting, you now have a whole change in the dynamic of how government is to be implemented, much like you had the challenge when South Africa turned over. But there was significant white backlash that was going on that began in 1870 in particular, and pushed its way forward through the middle of the 1875, 1876. And so all this is going on while Straker has his law degree and trying to find his way in his career, and he's trying to establish a practice. But being as adventurous as he is, as committed as he has been to issues of equal rights, he becomes part of the radical Republicans. And he is able to take league with the then the leader of the candidate for governor in South Carolina, who was a radical Republican, was Chamberlain. And Chamberlain is going against a strident, racist slave advocate of Hampton, who was formerly of the Confederate Army. And in 1876, you have a very heated election, not only on the national level, but on the local level, the gubernatorial level. And it was contested. The national election was contested. The votes out of South Carolina were contested with Rutherford Hayes being the winner of the national election, but they couldn't seat a government. And as part of the deal to get things done, Rutherford Hayes was allowed to become president, provided that the federal troops that had been put in South Carolina be withdrawn. And once they were withdrawn, it was a downfall of the radical Republicans, downfall of the Southern Republicans, and the infusion of the Democrats that were anti-abolition all the way across the board. Now, how does all this affect Straker? Well, Straker ran as a state rep in South Carolina in 1876. And because of this feud about who should be seated, not only on the national level, but on the gubernatorial level, where at the gubernatorial level, both sides claimed victory, but neither side could actually claim could form a government. But because Rutherford Hayes withdrew the federal troops, it allowed the Democrats to take control. And so when Straker was looking to be seated in his first term, his seat was denied. Okay, along with Chamberlain leaves the state and goes someplace else. But Straker was elected from Orangeburg County, South Carolina, which at the time was one of the largest, if perhaps the largest county in South Carolina. So much so that parts of that county was ultimately used to form two other counties that exist to this day. But Straker refused to accept the denial of his seat. So he ran again. And each time he won again because the county was 2/3 Black and 1/3 white. And each time they voted him back, but each time he was denied his seat. Okay. And that's a statement of his commitment, his firm commitment of saying, I am going to keep running until I cannot run anymore. That I see what my fate ultimately is going to be. But the Black folks in South Carolina saw how intellectually strong and committed this man was, that they voted him time and time again. And most importantly, he represented the commitment of Black folks to fight for their individual freedom. After all, it had been given to them, and nothing given to you, especially freedom, should be given up so willingly. So, but having failed the attempt to be able to be part of this Reconstruction, and I can't help but believe that what led him to ultimately come to South Carolina was believing, as well as leaving Barbados, okay? Because again, 1866, the war was over. All this news about Reconstruction was making its rounds. Why wouldn't I, if I was a Barbadian, look to be part of the great America dream and promise that seems to be emerging? And so he was looking to be part of that new wave of liberty and freedom for Blacks, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, as he later talks about in some of his other writings. But having seen his inability to make it in the legislature, he later became the dean of, I think it was Allen University. Allen University was a small, Black college, if you will, that was one of the few colleges that actually had a law department, and he became the head of that law department. Okay, and he also went about having a practice in Orangeburg County with two other Black representatives who had been ousted, Robert Elliott being one of them. And they tried to have their practice for a couple of years. And over time, it was not as thriving as he had desired it to be. And here is when I think the relationship with his wife comes in quite handy. Because in 1885, Straker goes to Detroit to provide some lectures on various subjects. And excuse me, and within a couple of years of 1885, I think it's in 1887, he actually picks up his bags and moves to Detroit. And it just makes sense that after seeing how whites in South Carolina, because I haven't talked about the violence that whites were putting in every day to keep Black folks from voting, Black folks from having the liberty of doing, and it's remarkably similar to what's going on here, okay? And the other remarkable parallel to this is, just as the protections of Reconstruction and the right to vote were taken away, remember that within the last 12 years, that the Supreme Court stripped away the protections of the Southern states to guarantee Black folks the ability to vote. And since that time, you have seen the step up in the in resurgence in the violence and attacks of Black people trying to vote throughout the South in particular. And it has spread throughout the rest of the nation. But the point is that the history of the 1865 through 1870 has repeated itself now. Okay.
Well, how do you view that parallel? Because I mean, to see that in 2021, that is still happening. I mean, it does not negate any work that would have been done before.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, you know, with your association with the Augustus Straker and all the work that he would have done to lessen this impact, how do you view it now?
How do I view why we are seeing it again?
Yes. Why do you think it is happening, and how do you view it now?
It is the nature of man to do what he has always done until somebody stops it. Okay. Never underestimate the willingness of evil to perpetuate and spread itself. That it requires a force greater than it to keep it in check and to keep it at bay. As my late pastor, Reverend Sampson, would so often say, there is no darkness that is more powerful than the light. When you turn on the switch, okay, the darkness must go away. But it's imperative for us to make certain that that switch stays on. Otherwise, the darkness will always be present. And if you look at the history of civil rights just in the United States, you'll see that it moves in 50 to 60 year swings. Okay, that the efforts of Reconstruction was the first strong volley of saying we are going to do something about this and make it right. But over the period of time, you know, in the early 1920s, you see the rise of the Klan. You see the rise of other hate groups to quash those efforts that actually began in South Carolina with the fall of the radical Republicans. It began to reach a crescendo in the early 1920s. It takes another 40 years, 50 years before we get to Brown to the versus Board of Education. It says, now we need to swing this back. And then you have, you know, an array of cases and law that kind of resurrects what was promised and acted upon during Reconstruction. And here we are 50 years later from the 60s. And what do we have? This active engagement to try to undo, and actually to undo the progress and the vision of hope and liberty that has abided within so many of us for all these decades.
Yes. Well, as you said that, because I remember in my readings, the civil rights movement would have really been birthed 64 years, I believe, you can correct me, 64 years after the work that David Augustus Straker had actually put in. And it's because of him,
Right.
what would have started. You know, how significant would you say that would have been? Because 64 years would have been then the cycle you're talking about.
Right. You know, it's his accomplishment in some circles is understated. Okay. I should say it's significantly understated. There's no question, because the doctrine, I should say, one of the things that the election of 1876 did was give fame. I should say, give flame to further heat up the efforts to bring separate but equal to life. Okay. And you know, that was all decided in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 by the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's the thing. when Straker was in Detroit, okay, and he was able to meet up with so many of people that his wife's family knew.
Yes.
You know, he took on the case was famously known as Ferguson versus Gies. Ferguson was a son of a doctor, son of one of the first Black doctors in Michigan and in Detroit, and he had gone to a restaurant to he and a friend to be serviced, and he was denied service. And Ferguson took some exception to that because in 1885, the Michigan legislature had adopted a provision that guaranteed equal rights and protections to all people, regardless of color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and was one of the few states to do that in spite of this rise of the separate but equal doctrine. Because of the relationship between Ferguson and Straker, Straker took that case and took it up to the Michigan Supreme Court. And this is 1890, 6 years before Plessy versus Ferguson. And he was able to persuade, Straker was, the Michigan Supreme Court to provide a 5-0 decision that says that the rights of Blacks, of former slaves, cannot be denied in the state of Michigan. Now, this is a remarkable, achievement in so many different ways. Given that Plessy came down 6 years later, but one of the things about it here is that the justice that wrote the opinion had written after the decision, had written Straker a letter explaining why he was able to make this decision and why all the judges were able to support the position. One of the things was that the justice happened to have been a former general in the Union Army. And he was heading up some of the colored troops. And what is often not mentioned is that he was one of 3 former officers of the Union Army who were on that court. Justice Morris happened to have lost his arm in the Battle of Chattanooga, I believe it was. And at least one other member of the court had also lost a limb. But what Justice Morris wrote in his letter to Straker is that having seen so many gallant soldiers who were fighting for their freedom die the way they have died, how can I deny them the right, the liberty guaranteed to them under the Constitution that we provided? And he goes on to explain that. And so the ability to not only with his intellect, but to appeal to the moral sense that should accompany the law, is what enabled Straker to engage the consciousness of these justices to be able to do what is fundamentally the right thing in spite of this rapid wave of separate but equal doctrine. And I can only imagine, and I hope to be able to track it down, what his reaction was when he heard the Plessy versus Ferguson decision being rendered. But Straker stands 3-4 cuts above a whole lot of other people in terms of his ability to make an impact, a long-lasting impact in the state of Michigan, and that is noted in quite a few other states around the country, especially during those times.
What would have happened in that 64-year period leading up to the beginning of the civil rights movement? What would have happened? Could you just briefly, summarize it for us? And the work that Straker would have done
between 1890 and 1964.
Yes, sir.
Um,
As in, if you could sum, based on what Mr. Straker would have done, what is it, I mean, that would have happened to lead up to the civil rights movement, the beginning of it,
I
60
see.
years?
I see. Um, it's that's a good question in some sense. Because Straker was a very optimistic man. He looked, as I've come to conclude, he looked at things from the depth of his religious beliefs and fundamental that as a Christian, as an educated man, that you look for the good instead of the bad in people. And believe me, in his separate writings, he talks about the evil of the South, as well as other um, uh, um, institutional approaches that were running through the United States at the time. Um, and Straker did not envision, at least in his writings, that we were going to turn out as bad as we turned out. I mean, he was one of the few people who put a letter in the time capsule for the city of Detroit in 1900. And when you read it, with the optimism that he envisions, having overcome the tragedies of the past. He looks at us going forward. But what happened here is what is happening now, that in the 1920s, you had an escalation in lynchings. Okay. They end up, the NAACP is founded the following year in 1909, a year after Straker has passed away. And so throughout the South, you had these various issues coming up. And even though this was Detroit still had a significant migration of people from the South who carried their racist views here. And not too long after his death in 1925, there was a major case called the Dr. O.C. Sweet case that rocked the nation, because it was a Black doctor trying to defend his family's home because he was the first Black to buy a house in the neighborhood. And the neighborhood attacked the house, and he was put up for criminal charges. But the information comes out to say that the police department was wrapped in with members of the Ku Klux Klan. And in Detroit, you see this clash of racial issues across the board, and it's spread throughout the nation. Detroit was just an example of what was happening throughout the nation in so many ways on racial terms. And it wasn't until folks gathered as a force in particularly the 1950s that the civil rights movement as such really began to take shape. Although I would prefer to say that the civil rights movement has happened from the day that Black folks first came over as slaves. Okay, it just took a long time for it to organize as a force. There's nobody who has seen or tasted slavery, been touched by slavery, who wants to forever remain a slave. Okay, white or Black, no matter what content, nobody wants to be a slave. And so those are the things that when you see the depth of commitment of evil, and I'm not, because this is the best way I can summarize it, of evil that took place in America through the years, notwithstanding the good parts of America that taken place, you are compelled as a people to fight back, organize it, find ways to take it down. And that's what Black folks here and throughout the world has been able to galvanize in one way or another. We are all united we are all united. We are all touched by the history
That's
that
true.
happened 300 years ago. We just don't want to connect the dots to it in that fashion.
Very true. Could I mention just one or two points there that come out of this? And I see the relationship between Barbados and the United States as something that's incredibly phenomenal. The links there, the Carolinas,
Yes.
Kentucky. I see clearly that David Augustus Straker, it's noted on the ICE website of the federal government that he was the first black ICE agent, which is a first, which is awesome. And I also see the fact that William Ferguson, who won the case, he was the client that David Augustus Straker
Oop, just lost you.
Yes. Your audio is out.
Yeah, he won his seat. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, he won his seat to become a member of House, the House of Representatives. So he became a phenomenal change agent himself,
Yes.
inspired by David Straker. And the Straker momentum is what I would like to call it.
Hmm.
I mean, we know that George Washington came to Barbados. We and he is the only place he's been to outside of the United States.
Mhm.
We see that Straker himself went up to Michigan, became a phenomenal change agent. He authored and I would say he started a media company, the Detroit Advocate,
Yep.
and he was a writer, prolific writer. He wrote about Toussaint Louverture, and I'd like to mention that two of Straker's books were gifted to me
Ah,
by none other than Judge Keith himself and the
Ah, there you go.
David Straker uh, Bar
What are the titles
Association.
of the books? Share the titles with us.
Yeah, the title of this one is A Trip to the Windward Islands,
yep.
or Then and Now by D. Augustus Straker,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And
Wow.
then the next one is The New South Investigated
Yes.
by Straker himself. And
Yep.
these were both signed off by none other than the Honorable Justice Keith. And you know, I'm a speaker. I'm as a minister of the gospel. I speak to encourage people and to share this gospel that Straker himself was a beneficiary of, that causes your eyes to open up, and see the enlightenment that you receive, you ultimately share it with others.
Yes.
And Straker himself, and we've heard the testimony of our esteemed justice here today talk about their faith.
Yes.
The faith that you get downloaded from heaven has no parallel, and
Hmm.
it causes you to be an ignition campaigner. You ignite the lives of people. You ignite the environment around you to be luminescent. And as Justice Keith shared about the light and how the light switch turns on by his former pastor, now deceased, gone up to be with the Lord. That momentum that we see in the life of Ferguson. I mean, he was inspired out of his normal framework to become a House of Representatives guy coming out of a medical background. And he himself became that change agent. And then we can
Right.
see the momentum of that, the Detroit Pistons, the city of Motown, how industrialization happened in Detroit like no other city on the planet, and
Mm.
black people were empowered to be engineers and change
Wow.
makers in the legal fraternity. And I'd
That
like
is
to mention one agent of change that affected me positively throughout my teenage life: the Winans. The
please tell.
Winans
Do
came from
tell.
Detroit.
Came from Detroit. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, no other music experience was like the Winans. I've got to tell you, I've listened to them throughout my life, and the fact that they came from Detroit, it shows. And just to summarize this, it's the experience of that, that a Barbadian catalyst could have gone up to America
Mhm.
and done what became I guess it's a precedent, Judge Keith, the first case in U.S. history that was won on the basis of civil rights at
Yep.
that level.
Right.
And it was, that momentous change that
Yes.
caused an eruption of luminescence in the civil rights movement. So
You know,
many examples are there.
Do you,
the other key piece there is that despite the fact that it ultimately became the minority opinion in the nation until Brown versus Board of Education in '54, it is important that we dissent. Okay, it is important that we dissent. Uh, my uncle, who sat on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for some 50 some odd years, recognized a change in the judicial philosophy over the last 30 years of his career. And he says, well, Terrence, I'm going to be writing a lot of dissents, but I'm going to write the dissents. I'm going to continue to write the dissents because someday somebody's going to look at it and say, this should be the law. Okay. And that's the importance of the other importance of the Ferguson versus Gee's decision, that it was the dissent there, but fundamentally, under the laws of God and the laws of nature and human law, it was the right thing to say, the right position to take, and there's nothing that can deny that fact. Okay, and it's also the reason. Excuse me, because just one other point. Talk about change agent. There's a reason we opted to take on his name as when we formed the Straker Bar Association back in 1990, thanks to Professor Emeritus Ed Littlejohn from Wayne State University here in Detroit, who first schooled us as to who Straker was. That was what the Straker Bar Association set about doing when it was formed, to be a change agent to bring justice and fairness to the legal process. I'm sorry, Crystal, you were saying something.
no, that's fine, because that's somewhat branches of my question. My question is, do you think enough has been done to honor this man and bring recognition to the work that he has done? I mean, you just mentioned the Augustus Straker Bar Association there in the US, and I'll direct the question to you as well, Patrick, in terms of Barbados. Do you think enough has been done to honor him here? I'll let the judge answer first.
The short answer is no. The other short answer is no. And the final answer is no. The one of the big differences between folks in the United States and in Europe, history lives in Europe every day. People talk of history like it's was the day before yesterday, not like it was 200 years ago, 300 years ago. We have a tendency to dismiss as just a footnote the history of our heroes. And one of the things that Straker does in his book on Toussaint is to say, look, white folks got all their heroes and they put them in song and in legend and everything else. We need one of our own to make a song about. Let's look at this Black Haitian and talk about the great things he has done and the way he was betrayed by the French. We are just beginning to recognize the importance of having our history live within the essence of our souls.
That's deep, Patrick.
That's deep. I love the way that you shared the perspective on that, Judge Keith. And I would say we haven't done enough to recognize him. There are other heroes as well that link the Barbados U.S. experience. For example, Crystal J, the lady who formed the National Nursing Association is a Black Barbadian-born woman.
Yep.
And she was in Harlem, New York. If you go to Harlem, you see some of those huge hospitals over there. You'll be wondering, wow, who was the inspiration behind these? And she worked with the First Lady, Lady Roosevelt.
Yep.
And what they did is they formed a nursing association that allowed for Black nurses to serve in the armed forces of the United States, eventually saving the lives of many of the soldiers because there weren't enough white nurses.
Right.
And the formation of the National Nursing Association caused for Black nurses to arise and work with their colleagues who were white. And she was in the U.S. in the 1870s as well, right?
That is amazing.
In the 1890s, I should say. I'm sorry. And so what can we do? Seeing that this Barbados U.S. thing looks really good, perhaps we can use this forum to generate a thought. And on the Barbados side, I'd definitely love to be um, engaging further. Me and Judge Keith actually have a plan, so we can talk about that in the future.
Okay.
But we have a plan to talk about a visit eventually from Barbados to the U.S. and then from the U.S. to Barbados. I've mentioned it at the highest levels in Barbados, and I'm sure we will be seeing Judge Keith and a contingent of judges on the island at some point. And I mean, I literally have mentioned it to our Governor General, and
Mm,
she's going to be a part of that visit.
That's good.
She's excited about it actually because she too
mm,
is a former justice,
okay.
appeals court justice. And so, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
That's yet to be seen. But our plans are definitely looking to honor these black heroes. And I mean, I keep going back to this point of the U.S. Barbados links, right? Because many of the heroes on U.S. soil are black Americans.
Mm,
Many black Americans. As a matter of fact, we're talking to one now. I've looked at Judge Keith's history on the bench, and he has done so many amazing things. Right, that's
Mm.
a separate story altogether. I mean, he is one of many heroes that have emerged in a huge country with a dynamic economy to see that our brothers and sisters up in the U.S. are doing so well and influencing such positive change, and then they're not hindered in linking those change agents from the past to the change that we need to see going forward. And that's what I think is dynamic about this whole experience. That the change is constantly, dynamically reasserting itself into
Yes.
our present day and our future steps. That's amazing, and it's phenomenal to see happen. You know.
Well, I will ask Judge Keith on a fairly personal note. How has the life of David Augustus Straker affected or impacted you personally? What was his life the reason you are a judge right now, or to tell us?
Um, no, it's not the reason that I became a judge, but I'm a history buff, if you can't tell by now.
I I can tell. You know your
Uh,
history, bro.
I'm a bit of a history buff that was instilled in me when I was a child. I knew the words to the Black National Anthem before I knew the words to the national anthem because because my dad instilled it in me as a child. Because every um, month, every February was Black History Month, and he would have a program celebrating that. Um, and so it was the history of the Black experience that was embedded in me at an early age, that got further embedded in me when my uncle became a judge, became a lawyer, then a judge. Um, but the way that uh, Straker's history influences me is the recognition that one, education is power, and that you must use, and this got, and again, one of those things that my uncle shared with me as well, is that if you as a Black person have a position of authority and power and do not use it to advance, to bring up your people, what good are you to our people?
Ooh.
Okay.
Mm, that's powerful.
Straker left Barbados in order to educate, to use his talents to educate, freed slaves. And when he got there, he decided that, wait a minute, looking around at everything, I need to have some legal knowledge to really affect change here. And he goes to law school to learn the process. He masters the process. He begins to understand the political process.
Mhm.
Okay. And he uses that to try to further the interests of Black folks in South Carolina. And when he left South Carolina, he brought that same commitment to Detroit in Michigan. And so the way it inspires me is to say, I have a continuing duty to reach back and give back to all those who made it possible for me to be here. I may not see the fruit of the tree for years to come, but doggone it, I have that faith of the mustard seed that it's going to be planted in rich soil. Okay, it's going to fall everywhere, but there's going to fall on some rich soil somewhere. And over time, that mustard seed will be able to feed a multitude. And that the word that I have will be the word that will be fed to thousands of people. And their belief and what I believe will give my people justice.
Wow. I'm glad I asked that question. Wow. Thank you so much, Judge Keith. And Patrick, I don't know if there's anything else that you wish to add, but I want to say thank you so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to commend you, Crystal J, on your visionary status as not just a reporter or a media professional. I think that you too are a visionary. I think by allowing yourself to see the value of this interview and to, allow it again to be expressed to a wider audience brings value to the cause of justice, the cause of rightness, right? Straker himself was immersed in that. This clearly reviewing his life here in a brief moment allows us to see and to expose the heart of this man. This man was driven by convictions that took over his safety, took over to leave a small island and to venture into the U.S. and then to be, I guess you could say, chased out of the South and landing himself in the North with his beautiful wife and you know driving this man uh, was inside of him the heartbeat of heaven.
Hmm.
And for you and I and Judge Keith to be here, uh, you know more or less resurrecting the history of this man, the historicity of his life, it speaks to vision on your part, Crystal J. So I have to commend you for allowing this. We Judge Keith and I, we do have busy schedules, but for you to take time from your schedule and make this a priority so that the world can benefit brings about that change that Straker was pushing for.
Amen.
So I commend you to have accepted the challenge from Straker himself today.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the
Absolutely.
connection.
You're welcome.
Well, it's just that we live this life and we never know what fruit it will yield. We're in 2021 discussing the life of a man who was born in 1842. So it is so
Hmm.
important for us to live the life that we're supposed to be living in order to be able to have fruit being born from it, even for decades, maybe even centuries to come, if the Lord wills. So I thank you, gentlemen, for your impact in your areas as well. And thank you for
Well,
your
thank
time in
Thank
sharing
you.
with us. The historian, Judge Keith, thank you so much. You remember those dates so well,
Yeah.
sharing with us
Great
here
thank
in
you.
interview.
Barbados. And my hope is that people would be educated and uplifted and empowered and even inspired and to go and research for themselves on the work of
Mhm.
Augustus Straker and see how even they can continue to keep the ball rolling on his life as well as other lives of the lives of other Barbadians who would have impacted and of course make that US Barbadian connection really strong. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much, David Augustus Straker. He was man of God, first of all, author, lawyer, and politician from 1842 to 1908. And I want to say thank you to you, Wayne County probate judge Terrence Keith, there, all the way in Michigan, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me, Crystal. And I look forward to being able to see you in person one day soon.
Yes, same here, same here. And Reverend Dr. Patrick Tanis, just Patrick, thank you for being with us and sharing with us as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.